Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to c4. Bishop f8 to c5. Pawn b2 to b4. Bishop c5 takes b4. Pawn c2 to c3. Bishop b4 to a5. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn e5 takes d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Queen d8 to f6. Bishop c1 to e3. Knight g8 to e7. Castle kingside. Castle kingside. Queen d1 to a4. Bishop a5 to b6. Knight b1 to d2. Knight c6 to e5. Rook a1 to b1. Knight e5 to g4. Rook f1 to e1. Knight e7 to c6. Knight d2 to b3. Queen f6 to e5. Knight d4 to f3. Queen e5 takes c3. Bishop e3 takes b6. Pawn c7 takes b6. Knight b3 to d2. Pawn d7 to d6. Rook e1 to c1. Queen c3 to a5. Queen a4 takes a5. Knight c6 takes a5. Pawn a2 to a3. Knight g4 to f6. Bishop c4 to b5. Pawn d6 to d5. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to g4. Rook c1 to c7. Bishop c8 to f5. Rook b1 to e1. Rook f8 to c8. Rook c7 takes c8, check. Bishop f5 takes c8. Knight f3 to d4. Pawn a7 to a6. Bishop b5 to d3. Pawn b6 to b5. Pawn f2 to f3. Knight g4 to h6. Pawn e5 to e6. Pawn f7 takes e6. Knight d4 takes e6. Bishop c8 takes e6. Rook e1 takes e6. Knight a5 to c4. Knight d2 to b1. Rook a8 to c8. Rook e6 to e2. King g8 to h8. Rook e2 to c2. Rook c8 to c6. Rook c2 to e2. Rook c6 to c8. Rook e2 to e7. Knight c4 to b2. Bishop d3 to f1. Rook c8 to c1. Knight b1 to d2. Rook c1 to d1. Knight d2 to b3. Knight b2 to c4. King g1 to f2. Pawn b7 to b6. Rook e7 to e8, check. Knight h6 to g8. Pawn g2 to g3. Rook d1 to b1. Bishop f1 to h3. Rook b1 to b2, check. King f2 to g1. Rook b2 takes b3. Bishop h3 to e6. Pawn h7 to h5. Bishop e6 takes g8. Pawn g7 to g6. Bishop g8 takes d5, check. King h8 to g7. Rook e8 to e7, check. King g7 to h8. Rook e7 to b7. Rook b3 takes a3. Bishop d5 takes c4. Pawn b5 takes c4. Rook b7 takes b6. King h8 to g7. Rook b6 to c6. Rook a3 takes f3. Rook c6 takes c4. Pawn a6 to a5. King g1 to g2. Rook f3 to e3. Rook c4 to c7, check. King g7 to f6. Rook c7 to a7. Rook e3 to e5. King g2 to f3. King f6 to f5. Rook a7 to f7, check. King f5 to e6. Rook f7 to b7. Pawn g6 to g5. Pawn h2 to h3. Rook e5 to c5. King f3 to e4. Rook c5 to c3. Rook b7 to b6, check. King e6 to e7. Rook b6 to a6. Rook c3 takes g3. Rook a6 takes a5. Rook g3 takes h3. Rook a5 takes g5. Rook h3 to h2. Rook g5 to a5. King e7 to f6. King e4 to f3. Rook h2 to h3, check. King f3 to f4. Rook h3 to h4, check. King f4 to f3. King f6 to g6. Rook a5 to a6, check. King g6 to f5. Rook a6 to a5, check. King f5 to f6. Rook a5 to a6, check. King f6 to f7. Rook a6 to a5. King f7 to g7. Rook a5 to a7, check. King g7 to f6. Rook a7 to a6, check. King f6 to g5. Rook a6 to a5, check. King g5 to g6. Rook a5 to a6, check. King g6 to f7. Rook a6 to a7, check. King f7 to g8. Rook a7 to a8, check. King g8 to h7. Rook a8 to a7, check. King h7 to h6. Rook a7 to a6, check. King h6 to h7. Rook a6 to a5. King h7 to h6. Rook a5 to a6, check. King h6 to g7. Rook a6 to a5. King g7 to f7. Rook a5 to a7, check. King f7 to e6. Rook a7 to a5. King e6 to f6. Rook a5 to a6, the game is a draw.